Hello, everybody. Good evening, good afternoon. Please let me know in the comments in the chat where you guys are watching from, where you're tuning in from. I see we've already got 400 or 500 people slowly coming into the chat. Again, please let me know what city or state or country you're in. So without further ado, my name is Richard Medhurst, and I'm very happy to welcome back a good friend and friend of the show, Scott Ritter. Scott is a former United Nations weapons inspector. He was also in the United States Marine Corps as an intelligence officer, and he wrote a great book last year called Disarmament in the Time of Perestroika, Arms Control and the End of the Soviet Union. So please be sure to check that out. Thank you, Scott, for coming on. It's nice to speak with you again and to see you. How are you?
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm doing well, thank you.
Scott, you know, I gave my own commentary, shall we say, the other day about this Ukrainian counteroffensive. You know, we all saw this column of destroyed tanks, the Bradleys, the Leopards. The counteroffensive, has it stopped? Has it failed? There's talk of it being frozen. What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, it's failed and it's going to fail. It has no chance of succeeding. Understand when we speak of the counteroffensive, what we're talking about is the assault breaching of a fortified position. That's a military term of art. It's one of the most difficult missions that can be assigned to a military unit, especially if the defensive positions are well prepared and supported by firepower, artillery, air power, etc. The Russian defenses in this area, are the most well-prepared defenses in modern history. They've been designed by a specialist in Russian defensive doctrine. He wrote the defensive doctrine. The defenses are based upon his instruction, and he has been put in command. So all the strengths accrue to Russia. In order for the Ukrainian offensive to be considered a success, it would have to breach the Russian defenses. And by breaching, that means you have to penetrate all three layers and clear the Russians out of the other side of the final defensive line. Only then can you have considered to have breached it. Anything short of that, you're trapped in the Russian defensive system and you're going to die. And so the Ukrainians haven't even cleared the initial contact zone of the first line of defense. They haven't penetrated the first line of defense. It's doubtful whether they've even made contact with the first line of defense. They're being stopped well short by the barriers that the Russians have put in place and by the flexible defense tactics that the Russians are employing to absorb the Ukrainian attack. And so here we are 2 weeks into this counteroffensive. They haven't even reached the first line of defense.
Oh, boy.
And they've been tasked with breaching the Russian defensive systems. I will tell you right now that they don't stand a chance of succeeding. I doubt they'll ever reach the first line of defense. I doubt they'd ever penetrate the first line of defense. And I will put every dollar I'll ever make in my entire life on the fact that they will never breach the totality of the Russian defenses. This is going to end up as a strategic defeat, not only for Ukraine, but for its NATO sponsors. Remember, these brigades that Ukraine is using for this fight have been created for this very purpose. Right. They have been equipped by NATO. They have been trained by NATO. They are attacking where NATO has told them to attack. This attack has been war gamed out on a NATO computer simulation known as Cora. Every aspect of this fight has been played out, simulated. And I have to tell you, somebody who has an experience in doing this kind of simulation in preparation of the Marine Corps' breach of Iraqi defensive lines back in 1991, which was successful, by the way, I can tell you that you can't accurately and with integrity simulate the reality of this battlefield and come up with a solution that says Ukraine can win. And what I'm
Hmm.
trying to say is that NATO has deceived the Ukrainians. NATO has done a war game that gave the Ukrainians a false sense of hope. NATO has willingly sent these Ukrainian soldiers to their death on the field of battle against the Russians.
So Scott, I went into this, and perhaps you could elaborate. I talked about because you mentioned these multiple layers of defense, and I was talking about Dragon's Teeth, the anti-tank ditches, or traps, pits, whatever, and then the zigzagged manned trenches for infantry positions. So I mean, are you saying basically that the Ukrainians are failing because of it's not a lack of equipment, a lack of training, it's insurmountable?
It's a combination of both. To be honest, I would never send, again, the units that should be used to carry out the assault breaching of a fortified defensive line should be highly trained units who are intimately familiar with the equipment that they're going to be using and the tactics that they're going to be employing.
And that's not the case, because these are new systems.
Yeah, giving the Ukrainians this NATO equipment at the last minute. Remember, they fell in on their equipment, their Bradleys and their Leopards, in January and February of this year, and then they were given rudimentary training at Grafenwohr and other NATO bases from the middle of January up until May. Mm-hmm. And then they were told to take this equipment and carry out the single most complicated assault mission imaginable. The Ukrainians don't know how to use their equipment. They're not familiar with it, especially in a combat tactical sense, where you need to be intimately familiar with every aspect of this equipment to make it do that which you not only want it to do, but what you're anticipating the necessity of doing. You can't anticipate something if you don't understand the equipment you're in.
Yeah.
You don't know how to operate it, don't know how it works. It's not seamless. There's no sixth sense taking place. They're simply driving a death trap to their imminent demise. The same thing with the Bradley. And even if they knew this equipment, they don't understand the tactics. They don't understand what they're supposed to be doing. And one of the reasons is because NATO has deceived them, because no commander in their right mind would allow themselves to initiate an assault breaching operation without considering all of the aspects of suppression. Suppression, there's a U.S. Army mnemonic that they use for assault breaching, and the first letter is an S, and it stands for suppression, and suppression is the key. Without suppression, nothing else happens, because you have to suppress the enemy's artillery. You have to suppress the enemy's anti-tank missiles. You have to suppress their air power. You have to screen yourself so that you can begin the very dangerous task of working your way through these obstacle belts that you spoke of, the minefields, the Dragon's Teeth, the initial trench works, the screening forces, to get to that first line of defense. And then you have to puncture that, clear the rear, and then move on. And you have to do that 3 times. And the whole time you have to do that, you have to suppress the enemy. There is no suppression taking place. It's not just the firepower. Electronic warfare is an important aspect of this, jamming the Russians' ability to communicate. Because if I'm a Russian in my trench line and here come the Ukrainians, and I'm trying to make contact with artillery to call in a fire mission, I shouldn't be allowed to do this. They should be jamming this signal. There should be no communication. I shouldn't be able to contact air power. But the Russians right now have seamless command and control. They're coordinating their fire support. The Ukrainians are walking into pre-designated kill zones where the artillery is just pounding down on them. The aircraft are coming in without any intervention. There's no air defense worthy of the name. And the Ukrainians are getting slaughtered, not just on the line of contact, but in the rear assembly areas. This was known. Anybody who knows anything, and I have to imagine that the NATO instructors are familiar with assault breaching operations. They wrote the darn book, that they should never have allowed this attack to take place, because it's literally suicide.
Hmm.
The only way you could justify this attack is if you artificially skewed the computer simulation so that the opponent ran away. I call it the Monty Python defense. Search for the Holy Grail. The
Right.
white rabbit shows up and they run away. And basically, the Ukrainians become the white rabbit and the Russians become the knights of the round table and they run away. That's the only way this simulation works, is if you give the Russians all of the negative attributes that I guess Ukrainian propaganda and Western propaganda has been putting on them. But what we found out is that everything that the West has been saying negative about the Russian troops is proven to be false.
Right.
First of all, they built very impressive defensive positions. I remember when the Russians were first digging it, all of the bros and the fellas and anybody else you want to say online were mocking it. Look at that. Those dragon teeth are going to stop nothing. What are they digging lines behind for? What's the purpose of all this? It's called doctrine, guys. Doctrine. And the Russians executed it perfectly. And then they said, well, these mobilized forces, they can't fight. They have no morale, no training. They weren't trained.
Right. They always said this thing about morale. There's no morale.
Low morale. And then Russian generals and colonels and majors, they're all drunk. They don't know what they're doing. There's no command and control. The Russians don't have to do anything. Blah, 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 blah. Turns out the Russians are perhaps the most professional force in Europe right now. Those mobilized guys, they're not only trained well, pretty damn brave, standing their ground. The Ukrainians are saying, we expect you to run away, and you guys are fighting for every square inch.
Mm-hmm.
And the Russians are smart about this. They let the Ukrainians come in, and they fix them. And then when the Ukrainians commit to where the Russians want them to commit, because the Russians will hold strong in one area, loosen in another, the Ukrainians will migrate to the loose. The Russians will pull back because they're not in the business of needlessly dying. Are the Russians suffering casualties? Putin has said so. 1 to 10, he said. 1 to 10. And that's a president who knows what he's talking about. That means for every 10 Ukrainian casualties, there's 1 Russian casualty. Now, right now, we're probably looking at around 10,000 Ukrainian dead.
Okay.
That means that the Russians have probably lost about 1,000 dead. That's a lot of guys.
I mean, I know it's obviously a lot of people, but the ratio is incredible. I mean, how is that? How is that possible?
Because the Ukrainians aren't suppressing. Because the Ukrainians are literally
I mean, they have no air force, right?
Their force.
They have no air force.
Their force is exposed to everything the Russians have. The Russians are able to come in with their air force, their fixed wing, their helicopters. They're able to employ their artillery. They're able to bring in their anti-tank screening forces and kill everything that moves. That's what's happening.
I mean, the thing I wanted to ask you, Scott, is that the Russians are defending a very, very long line, right? So I mean, you could argue that in one sense, I mean, perhaps another army would have they would have collapsed at one point, because it's a very long line if we consider all the defenses that they've built. The other thing I wanted to mention, the mud. This is mud season, and I thought Ukrainians would know their own weather, right? So you got vehicles getting bogged down and trapped.
Well, the weather is bad. It's clearing up now. We're in June, so the Rasputitsa, the muddy season, is either over or just about to be over. But you're right. The ground is still going to be soggy, especially when employing 62-ton Leopard tanks, which are not designed for unimproved roads. The small bridges that operate in this area of the world, the fields, it makes it difficult for the Leopards to maneuver. But the other thing is, it is a long line of defense. But understand that the Russians learned their lesson from last September, where they sought to hold a long line of contact with insufficient troops, and they had strong points with big gaps between them, not enough artillery to cover the gaps, and the Ukrainians were able to shoot the gaps and get into the Russian rear and cause a collapse of the Russian defenses. That's a strategy the Ukrainians appear to be trying to replicate right now, but the Russians have learned their lessons. We're not dealing with 180,000 Russian troops like we had back in September, October. We're dealing with around, I would say, between 500 and 700,000 Russian troops. Many of them
Wow.
aren't in the line of contact. They're being held in reserve, ready to counterattack, which is, the final part of the Russian defense doctrine, which is to absorb the attack of the attacking party, let them spend their combat power, and then at the moment of their greatest weakness, to launch a concerted counterattack to push them back and seize the offensive. So the Russians have about 220,000 troops that have yet to be committed into this fight, who are well trained, equipped with the best equipment possible, and they're standing by, get the Red Star cluster, Green Star cluster, or whatever the Russian signal is to advance. But meanwhile, the Russians have 450, 500,000 troops that they've put into these defensive positions that are not all in the front line. They're defending in depth,
Yes.
doctrine, and they have more than enough manpower to defend the totality of their space. The Ukrainians will not find any gaps, any weak spots.
I don't know, Scott. I heard differently on CNN and BBC. I heard the Russians are losing and they're failing, and the propaganda was really something. I mean, you alluded to it earlier. Bakhmut was also one of these stories, right? They kept saying the Russians have not captured it and this and that. What do you think of Bakhmut? Because we can't talk about Ukraine and not discuss Bakhmut because it's its longest battle in this war. What are your thoughts on the whole thing?
Well, keep in mind that the NATO forces that have been trained for this offensive, the 9 to 12 brigades, constitute around 50, 60,000 troops. The battle for Bakhmut cost Ukraine 75,000 dead. And if you don't understand that just ripped a gaping hole in the Ukrainian order of battle, and that was devastating to the morale of the Ukrainians, and that made it impossible for Ukraine to survive, literally, if they went and lost another 60,000, which you're preparing to do in this counteroffensive. Bakhmut will go down in the history of this conflict as one of the pivotal moments. It's where the back of the Ukrainian military was broken by Wagner in the fighting for Bakhmut. This was bloody fighting. Wagner suffered, I think, an estimated 30,000 dead, which is a lot of dead.
Yeah.
But understand that Wagner was fighting in an urban environment. Normally, when you're on the attacking side, you want a 3-to-1 advantage over the defender. That means for every one defender, you need three of your guys. But Wagner is attacking a fortified urban target, which means that you would want to have 5 or 7-to-1 advantage. Wagner was attacking at a 1-to-3, 1-to-4 disadvantage. That is, for every 3 or 4 Ukrainian defenders, there was just one Wagner fighter.
So they're outnumbered.
They're outnumbered, but they had better tactics. They had better command and control, better operational sense. They had also, I think, a better fighting spirit. They were able to maintain pressure against the Ukrainians on a continuous basis, and they wore the Ukrainians down, and then they killed them. It's called the meat grinder for a reason. But the Wagner operation became a deliberate killing machine sometime, I would believe, in May, when it was clear that the Ukrainians were going to defend the Soledar-Bakhmut complex. The decision was made not to focus on territorial gains, but on giving the Ukrainians the opportunity to reinforce and die. And that was the success of the Wagner operation, is that they pulled in tens of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers who would otherwise be alive today and be able to support the counteroffensive that's underway. So Bakhmut ripped the heart out of the Ukrainian army even before this counteroffensive began.
There's this new decree, shall we say, that was issued by Putin that members of Wagner and other auxiliary forces, shall we put it, have to sign an agreement to fully integrate into the Russian armed forces. And Prigozhin is saying that no one's going to sign a single contract. Do you see a power struggle here between Shoigu, the defense minister, and Prigozhin? Because you've seen the videos and the messages where he's trashing them and saying you're not giving us enough support. But now that they have to sign this contract,
I think a lot of what Prigozhin was doing during the actual battle was part of a psychological warfare operation against the Ukrainians to create the perception of disunity, disharmony, weakness, so that the Ukrainians wouldn't withdraw from Bakhmut, but double down on stupid and say, we have a chance to win. All we have to do is push and Wagner will collapse because they have this dysfunction. But I think the source of the dysfunction is real. I think there's real dissatisfaction between elements of Wagner and the Russian Ministry of Defense. Wagner was created as a unique contracting vehicle to provide military expertise to the militias of the Donbass and Donetsk and Lugansk at a time when the territory was Ukrainian, and Russia is constitutionally prohibited from providing military forces. They can't deploy the regular Russian army onto Ukrainian soil. So Wagner was created. People call it a mercenary outfit. It's not a mercenary outfit. Mercenaries don't die for their country. Mercenaries fight for money.
Right.
And purpose of mercenaries are to live and go spend that money. Wagner is composed of 100% Russian patriots, people who are ready to lay their lives down for their country, but they operate on a different contractual basis than the regular army because legally that's what has to happen. But one thing that has happened is that now that Lugansk and Donetsk have been absorbed by Russia and now Russian territories, and now that Russia has had a chance to harmonize Russian legal structures with those two territories, Wagner no longer operates within the framework of the Russian Constitution or Russian law. You can't be a private military contractor. Now, what complicates this further is the fact that the private military contractor is just a contractual subterfuge. Wagner, I believe, works for Russian military intelligence, the GRU, and takes its orders from the Russian General Staff. It's a specialized combat unit for specialized tasks and purposes. And I do believe that if Wagner is going to continue to operate on Russian soil, that there will have to be a legal normalization of Wagner. But you want to do this in a manner that doesn't compromise that which makes Wagner special. And that is, of course, its unique command structure, very streamlined command procedures, and the esprit de corps that comes with having a military system that's based upon a meritocracy where the most qualified people rise to the top and competence is treasured overall. And that's why Wagner's not in the front lines right now, because Wagner has until August, I think August 5th is when Prigozhin said they'll be reintroduced, to get their act together. And if they don't, I don't think Wagner will be reintroduced. I don't see Wagner, Prigozhin isn't going to get his way. That's the bottom line. Either Wagner is an institution or each individual member of Wagner will be compelled to enter into a legally binding relationship with the Russian government that is consistent with the Constitution of Russia. This is an absolute prerequisite, and it will happen because the Russian military understands that Wagner is a unique asset that is, well positioned to provide lethal battlefield support. It's a force multiplier, and there are going to be future battles in well-defined geographical areas where having Wagner take over that sector would be to the benefit of Russia. So I see them solving this problem, but there is a problem between Prigozhin and Shoigu. Prigozhin's made it personal, and he's going to have to either back down or move out of the way. But let's just make this clear. Prigozhin, I don't believe he has any ambition of challenging Putin. That is ludicrous. But B, if he were, he wouldn't survive very long. And I'm not saying dying. I'm just saying that Prigozhin has to understand that he exists because of Putin. And Putin can make all that which defines Prigozhin go away that quick. And if Prigozhin doubts it, he just needs to pick up the phone and call Khodorkovsky in London and say, "Hey, how'd that work out when you took on Putin? What happened? You went to jail for a long time, right? Now you're in exile. Yeah, it worked out really well for you." It won't work out for Prigozhin, so Prigozhin's going to have to tone it down.
Yeah, I certainly didn't think that Putin would enter the discussion. I thought maybe Shoigu, because he usually I get the vibes of Sudan, where you have Dagalo, who, with his rapid strike forces, and after Bashir was gone out of the picture, it's because his rapid strike forces were also in the army, but not really. It's kind of like Wagner. But anyway, I was wondering if you heard yesterday Shoigu's speech. He was talking about the United States and UK striking Crimea, or planning to strike Crimea, and he singled out the HIMARS system, and he singled out the Storm Shadow system. So those are our things. And he was saying that if you do this, if you hit Crimea, this is going to be outside the scope of the special military operation. So it was like he was essentially saying that we will consider this a declaration of war, right?
He said that we will recognize you as parties to the conflict, but then he said that Russia will strike back at decision-making centers in Ukraine. So understand
I thought this was already the case.
Again, no. The fact that that Zelensky is able to live, the fact that the Ukrainian parliament is able to meet, the fact that
I meant that we're parties to the conflict. I thought that was clear to them.
The fact that any of these Ukrainian personalities can get on TV and be photographed is proof positive that Russia has not made the concerted decision to suppress Ukrainian command and control, Ukrainian decision-making centers. They have on limited occasions struck against select targets in retaliation for select deeds. Mm-hmm. But I think what Shoigu is saying here is that should Ukraine use these American and British supplied weapon systems against Crimea, that all restrictions against decision-making targets will be lifted. And it's just sort of a polite way of saying we're going to kill you all, because that's what will happen. They will strike every place these people are hiding, every place they operate, and there will no longer be freedom to govern Ukraine as they see fit. The government will be hiding in holes in the ground.
Yeah, I mean, I meant that we are already parties to the conflict. I thought that much was clear, but the level of escalation is getting more and more dangerous. And did you see the peace treaty or draft peace treaty that Putin held up when the African delegation arrived in to see first Zelensky and then him? And he said that we signed this over a year ago. So this was already signed by the Ukrainian delegation. And at the time it was understood that the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson went down and told Zelensky to pull out. I mean, this whole war could have been over a year ago already, over a year ago. What happened here?
Well, remember, let's back up even further. When France and Germany and Ukraine pulled out of Minsk effectively in October of 2021, they shut the door on what could have been an automatic peace environment. And think of it today. What are the Ukrainians demanding of Russia? They're demanding that Russia gets out of all of their territories. Now, the Ukrainians have suggested that Crimea could be up for negotiation. So had the Ukrainians accepted Minsk, they'd be getting the same thing that they're now sacrificing hundreds of thousands of their troops to accomplish. Yeah. But it was Ukraine that, and together with Germany and France, that pulled out of Minsk. Then Russia turned around and said, well, if we're not going to do Minsk, let's do a new European security framework. And they put two draft treaties on the table, one for NATO, one for the United States, and said, let's talk about this. But they were ignored. Mm-hmm. So they had no choice but to carry out a preemptive act of self-defense, which is legitimized under Article 51 of the United Nations Charter. Now, here's the interesting thing. People say, well, where's the evidence of that, Ritter? Well, I don't have it. I mean, it's been hinted at, suggested, but people are saying because the Russians didn't put it out there, it can't exist. I think what Putin just did is prove that the Russians don't say something unless they have documented fact. The Russians said early on that the Ukrainians had agreed to this, but the Ukrainians were denying. Putin has now put out documented fact, what the Ukrainians did. And the Russians are sitting on this. I think the Russians have to do a better job of information warfare, especially when it comes to establishing who is responsible for this war, because it's not Russia. Russia is not responsible for this war. NATO is responsible. The United States is responsible. England is responsible. Germany is responsible. France is responsible. Ukraine is responsible. These are the responsible parties to this conflict. Russia was backed into a corner and literally had no other choice. Had Russia not intervened when it did, there's every reason to believe that in the first week of March of 2022, the Ukrainians would have launched an assault with overwhelming force. Remember, NATO has been training the Ukrainian military since 2015. Mm-hmm. And this NATO-trained army was assembling in the Donbass, ready to carry out an offensive strike against the breakaway areas of Donetsk and Lugansk. That's why Russia launched a preemptive strike to nullify that and then put Ukraine in a position where it would have to consider terms of surrender. That was the whole purpose of the special military operation. It wasn't to steamroll the Ukrainian army, take Kiev, etc. It was to create the perception of danger sufficient enough to get the Ukrainians to the negotiating table, which Russia did within 3 days of the war starting. Ukraine was negotiating in Gomel, Belarus, and then get them to conclude a peace treaty that met some of Russia's primary goals and objectives, which the Ukrainians signed off on and should have been implementing on 1 April. But NATO intervened, pulled the plug on that. These were decisions made by NATO, made by Ukraine, not by Russia. Russia didn't want to be involved in this war, but here we are today. But the reality is that Russia has in effect ceded the information warfare theater of operations to Ukraine and the United States, who are in the business of just flooding the zone, so to speak, with disinformation. Now, the Russian strategy, again, I can't defend it because I don't know their reasoning, but I will tell you this. Russian reality is becoming readily visible to everybody, meaning that everything Russia has said is coming true. The Ukrainians are Nazis. There can no longer be a debate about this. We see the odious nature of this regime. We see their soldiers worshiping Stepan Bandera, wearing the insignia of the Nazis.
It's shameful.
So that's not even a question right now. And then the question of, can Russia win? I think that's being answered. Russia's winning right now decisively. How will this war end? I think that's also being decided right now with a Russian strategic victory. So the Russians are basically letting their actions speak for themselves. They're not in the business of trying to impress you and I with the sophistication of their press releases. They're in the business of winning this war, and right now that's exactly what they're doing.
Yeah, I agree with you, and Scott, you worked as a United Nations weapons inspector. You understand these issues. What do you think of depleted uranium being sent to Ukraine now? Britain we already sent it a few months ago in the tank shells. I know they have better armor piercing capabilities, but you and everybody knows what happened in Fallujah, what happened in Yugoslavia. These things have long-lasting effects on the environment and on people. So I don't understand how we can say we care about Ukraine and then we send depleted uranium to destroy their country.
Well, understand that the United States has not recognized the medical findings that you speak of. There's plenty of evidence to show that the United States has sought to manipulate the World Health Organization and other non-governmental, medical-related organizations that have investigated the consequences of depleted uranium poisoning in Fallujah and Basra and elsewhere. So the United States can't come out and suddenly change its tune. So it's always said that these weapons don't pose a threat, that this is, anti-American propaganda, and therefore they're not going to let these reports influence, important policy decisions pertaining to the defense of Ukraine, whom the United States claims they care about. The other thing is, while the media talks about the poor quality of the Russian weapons, I think the United States, especially the Defense Intelligence Agency and other intelligence services, know full well that Russian equipment is very good and designed to survive just about anything NATO can throw at it. And so when the British said that they're going to provide the Challenger 2 tanks, the thing that makes the Challenger 2 special from an offensive standpoint is the 120 millimeter cannon. But that cannon, using a conventional round, can't penetrate an advanced mod T-80 tank or the T-90 assault breaker tank. And so if you're going to give this weapon to the Ukrainians, you have to give them the means to convert that weapon into a tank killer, a Russian tank killer. And depleted uranium was assessed as giving the 14 Challenger 2 tanks that capability. Remember, we're talking 14 tanks. I don't know what the basic load of the Challenger is, and I don't know what percentage of rounds would be depleted uranium penetrator rounds, but they supplied Ukraine with sufficient ammunition to use the Challengers in a tank killing role. I think the Leopard has proven to be a disappointment on any number of levels. And the United States now is looking at providing the Abrams tank. And we're running up into the same quandary that if you don't give the Abrams tank world-class capacity to kill Russian tanks, then the Abrams tank will be destroyed on the field of battle, and that will be embarrassing. So we're now saying that if the Abrams go in, we're going to provide the Abrams crews with depleted uranium penetrators. The good news is we're only talking ammunition sufficient for 30 to 50 tanks. The bad news is that if the Ukrainians use this ammunition, or even if their tanks are destroyed with the ammunition inside and they start cooking off, that you are going to contaminate Ukrainian soil. And this will have a detrimental impact on the lives of any Ukrainian civilians who come in contact with the depleted uranium dust, so to speak, that's being produced. Remember, the dust isn't so much dangerous from its radiation standpoint. You actually get greater background radiation just standing outside than you're going to get exposed to depleted uranium. The reason why they use the term depleted is because its principal radioactive component has been stripped away through the enrichment process, and what's left is depleted uranium, a very dense, toxic metal. It is toxic. There's high toxicity. And when the metal is absorbed into the lungs and into the bloodstream, it can have very negative health effects on the person who absorbed it, and also anybody that may come in intimate contact with him. And this is why mothers of soldiers who have operated in that area, or civilians who live in Fallujah, are giving birth to defective children, because the child in the mother's womb, of course, is dependent upon the mother's bloodstream, and the mother is breathing in or otherwise absorbing this depleted uranium poison, this toxic metal, and that's getting in there, and then it's infecting her blood supply. And and that blood supply is then transferred to the baby, so the baby is condemned for this kind of deformations and such. We know this, but we suppress it. We don't want to admit that this is what happens when you use depleted uranium.
Oh, that's horrific. Really, I've told I've said this before that you have a higher rates of birth defects, congenital heart disease in Fallujah than you do in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. So I think that speaks for itself. And what you just described is really heartbreaking. Scott, given the inability to actually make use of the Leopard tanks, the Bradleys, and whatever Challengers and Abrams come along, what's the point of giving the Ukrainians F-16s? I know they wanted this for so long, but what is the logic behind all of this flow of arms? Is a money-making machine perhaps a fitting term?
Well, here's the problem. I try to have respect for the professional knowledge of the people who are in positions of authority today in the U.S. military and in the government, who make these decisions to provide weapons to the Ukrainians. And as such, look, if I were in that position, I would have early on advocated the opening of ammunition production for Soviet-era artillery systems. And I would have made sure that the Ukrainians had an endless supply of 152 and 122 millimeter artillery shells. I would have scoured the earth for all relevant Soviet-era equipment.
This is what I wanted to ask you. Yeah, because they're trained on this.
For instance, the old T-55 tank, is a weapon system that dates back to the 1950s, but it's been upgraded, I believe, by the either the Czechs or the Slovaks, upgraded so that it is actually a fairly lethal battlefield weapon with some amount of survivability, easy to operate. The Ukrainian tankers will have no problem using this equipment. They would be better off with these old 1950s era upgraded T-55s than they would be with the Leopard, because the Leopard's too complicated to maintain, too complicated to operate, and the Ukrainians just have no experience in using a weapon system like this. So because, the Ukrainians have been provided with, limited quantities of these upgraded T-55s, but I would have gone to the Israelis early on, and I would just loaded up cargo ships with, the old Soviet armor that they've captured over the course of the years, and I would have had that stuff, run through a production line quality refurbishment capability early on. I would have done all this early on so that the Ukrainians would have been given military power up front. But this entire posture of supplying the Ukrainians with billions of dollars of weaponry has been incremental in nature, and deliberately so. We're trying to drag this conflict out. We're not trying to win it because, again, an outright victory brings with it the risk of Soviet nuclear or Russian nuclear weapons. Russia has said, and Vladimir Putin reiterated it just the other day, that while it will never use nuclear weapons first, it will consider the employment of nuclear weapons if Russia's existential survival is put at risk, even in a non-nuclear manner. Mm-hmm. So for the United States and Europe to be pushing for a Ukrainian outright victory that resulted in the liberation of territories that have been acquired by Russia, it doesn't matter that NATO doesn't recognize it, the European Union doesn't recognize it. What matters is that Russia recognizes it, and the loss of these territories therefore kicks in constitutional obligations of self-defense, which means that Russia would use nuclear weapons in response. There was a Russian academic, Sergei Karaganov, who just wrote an article in a Russian journal, and he actually advocates in favor of Russia carrying out a preemptive nuclear strike against Europe. because he said that he doesn't believe any American president is willing to exchange Boston for Poznan, a Polish city, which implies Russia would nuke that. Now, we don't know how the United States would respond. Joe Biden calls the defense of NATO a sacred mission. But when confronted with the Russian use of nuclear weapons on NATO soil against a NATO ally, would the United States respond in a manner that guaranteed the death of every American, every person in Europe? Or would the United States back down and seek to negotiate an end? Carter Gunn believes the United States would back down. I believe the United States would nuke Russia, and then I believe it would be general nuclear war. We'd all die. But so we have today the real risk of nuclear conflict, the real risk, and so I have to believe that the NATO/American planners of this conflict understand the potential consequences, and as such are engaged in a very cynical use of military power, not to promote Ukrainian interests, but to use Ukraine as a proxy to weaken Russia, but not weaken Russia to the extent that Russia feels threatened and will use nuclear weapons, but to weaken Russia so that the credibility of Vladimir Putin is diminished to the point that he can be replaced in the 2024 election by a sort of a populist uprising of Russian people. And that's what I think is happening here. This is a very incremental support of Ukraine, not designed to help Ukraine win, but to help Ukraine continue the conflict. None of the weapons that have been provided are game-changing weapons. Many have been sold as a game-changing weapon, but none of them are. Neither will be the F-16. The F-16 is not suitable for this conflict. It's a single-engine jet fighter that can operate in numbers guided by AWACS or other ground control presences. If used properly against an enemy that lacks air defense and lacks an air force, the F-16 can be of deadly impact. But what happens when the F-16 enters heavily defended airspace? It will be shot down. What happens when the F-16 engages in aerial combat with the Russian Air Force? It will be shot down. What happens when the F-16 tries to land at its new Russian home, only to find that the runway has been cratered? The bunker that they're supposed to be parking in has been destroyed, and they now have to learn to operate from an improvised airfield that will probably break it quicker than the Russians would ever shoot it down. The F-16 is not a wonder weapon. The models that they would receive, there's talk that maybe the first batch would come from the Netherlands. But think what I'm saying then, because the Netherlands has specifically told the Ukrainians, we won't provide you with the F-16s while they continue to have a viable shelf life. That means that the Netherlands will only part with the F-16s once the guarantees that are attached to the F-16 on production are expired. So the Ukrainians will be getting the oldest possible airplane in the worst possible condition with the greatest possible chance of breaking down. And this is before it even takes off and gets shot down or tries to land and crashes.
I mean, wouldn't A-10 Warthogs be more suitable against Russian armored vehicles and these positions? I know they're retiring them, but
the A-10 would be again have to fight its way into an integrated air defense network. Understand that even during Desert Storm, we kept the A-10 operating above 30,000 feet because of the threat posed to it by Iraqi air defense systems. Even on the eve of the war, there were still sufficient air defense systems, and the A-10 suffered some casualties. The A-10 is not survivable in the Ukrainian conflict. Simply not survivable.
They have the S-300 and S-400s, so I I don't know what would be survivable, to be honest.
Well, they have the Pantsir. Remember, I mean, The A-10, what makes it attractive is its ability to burp. And what I mean by burp is I'm talking about that 30 millimeter
Right, the cannon.
Gatling gun comes in and goes burp and spews out depleted uranium rounds, by the way,
Lovely.
which penetrate armor and blow them up. But to do that, to burp, you have to be close to your target.
You got to swoop down.
The Russians have total control of that space. Remember, we go back to what I talked about earlier, suppression. The Ukrainians have no ability to suppress Russia's air defense systems, whether it be surface-to-air missiles or its air-to-air capacity with jet fighters. So the introduction of any aircraft into the zone, they're going to have to overcome the most, I guess, densely packed integrated air defense network the world has ever seen. And that's what Russia has assembled in the Special Military Operations Zone. They're going to have to come face to face with an Air Force that's designed to shoot them down over the horizon. Mm-hmm. The irony is the Ukrainian Air Force will most likely never, ever see a Russian airplane, especially now. When they take off, they'll be picked up by Russian radars, and Russians will be launching their air-to-air missiles at a range of around 120 kilometers, which means that the first thing that the airplanes are going to hear is a warning indicator or warbling in their ears as the system warns them about a missile coming in. That missile will probably hit their aircraft and shoot them down. So this is just another miracle weapon that what Zelensky's hoping for isn't these weapons, because he knows that A, it's already too late, and B, they're not going to change the outcome on the battlefield. What Zelensky's hoping for is direct NATO intervention, to get NATO sucked into this war so that Ukraine can survive. And so, he keeps arguing for these weapon systems, knowing they're not going to work, knowing that they're going to be destroyed, but also hoping that through their destruction, NATO is motivated enough to cross over and help. But then the question has to be asked:
is he nuts?
What can NATO do? And the answer is nothing. NATO does not have the ability to generate the kind of combat power necessary to check the Russian military advance. Remember, the Ukrainian military is several 100,000 strong, which makes it larger than any other army in Europe, save the Turkish army. And it's has more combat experience, more. The equipment works. They have hundreds, if not thousands, of tanks. What do the Germans have? Most of the German tanks rot in warehouses or in barracks because they don't train with them.
Probably for the best.
Worth of 2A6s or 2A7s that they rotate amongst units so they can be trained in it, because they don't have enough functional tanks to man each unit. This is the reality. So, Ukraine can ask for these weapons. The West will continue to provide these weapons, but as I think we've seen play out before us, as the Russians say, the Leopard tank burns as well as any Russian or Soviet tank, and it will burn.
I know this is not exactly comparable, but because we're in a different age of warfare and so on, and aircraft, but it kind of reminds me of World War II, in Europe. I mean, who rules the skies of Europe? It's the RAF, and it's the United States Army Air Force. So, the German Air Force is like non-existent. And in this capacity, just to draw an analogy, what Ukrainian Air Force, what are they going to do? They need so long to train with it, just to train with it. And I find it, if you're someone who's trained on a system, let's say a Soviet system, your muscle memory, your reflexes, your instinct, I mean, you're trying to reprogram someone who's trained on these systems. That must be incredibly difficult and arduous.
Well, it is. Look, the United States Air National Guard has a program. I think it's run by the South Carolina Air National Guard, but I could be wrong on that. where they train Allied pilots who previously were trained on Soviet-era aircraft, MiG-29s, Su-27s, and they trained them to transition to the F-16. And these pilots have said a couple things. One, the program is 6 months long. And by the time you finish that program, you basically have the ability to take off, fly left and right, and land. What you don't have the ability to do is evade enemy air defenses or engage in sophisticated air-to-air combat. Now, let's say you have one of these, let's say the Ukrainians got this 6-month transition training. They're now in the F-16 and they're flying a combat mission, and suddenly they're engaged in aerial combat against a Russian Su-34 or Su-35. As the data inputs come in, understand that the first thing that's going to happen is the Ukrainian is going to be confused, because his adrenaline is going to tell his body to revert to muscle memory. And so he's going to be automatically seeking to fly the Soviet era aircraft that he was trained to fly. Instead, he's now in this American airplane with totally different avionics. The cockpit is set up totally differently. The flight systems are totally different. So already his brain is starting to slow down because he has to convert initial thoughts into newly learned activity. You have to overcome muscle memory. So he's not maneuvering. He's not juking left and right when he needs to. He's going to be slow moving, and he's going to get shot down every single time. It is literal suicide. The best thing that could happen here is that the United States train Ukrainian pilots from scratch.
Right.
What you want is a pilot with no experience flying any Soviet-era aircraft. You want his only experience, the F-16, so that the muscle memory is there. And with that, he might have a fighting chance of surviving, not prevailing, but surviving, of doing that which is necessary to get out of the danger zone. This isn't Top Gun when you're on the highway to the danger zone. You want to get away from the danger zone because you're going to die otherwise. But that's the best chance. And again, the U.S. Air Force pilots mentioned that. They say the best graduates we have are the foreign pilots that have minimal or no experience flying a MiG or a Sukhoi, that the totality of their military flying experience is wrapped up in this F-16, because then that F-16 defines their flying experience. But if you have a pilot that's been for 10 years flying a MiG-29, and suddenly you transition them to the F-16, and then shortly after that, you bring him to Ukraine because they're demanding them now, and he takes off and he's engaged in air-to-air combat against a Russian aircraft. He's going to be thinking he's flying the MiG, not the F-16, and he's going to die.
Yeah, I figured as much, but of course I wanted your expert opinion on it. And Scott, just before I continue, I want to say we've got 2,300 people watching. Please make sure you guys have pressed the thumbs up, the like button, because we only have 900 likes on the video. So it helps the channel and the video to be seen on YouTube.
Maybe I have to do a better job.
No, not at all. Scott, I wanted to ask you a bit about China, but just one last thing about Ukraine. The Russians are moving their nuclear weapons to station them in Belarus. We had these drone strikes on the Kremlin. I can't believe I'm saying this sentence. Drone strikes on the Kremlin, which is old news now. But I mean, you wrote this book about the Cold War. You worked and lived through it. Are we closer to nuclear war today than back then?
That's a difficult question to answer, because in many ways we're comparing apples to oranges. I'd say we're in a very dangerous situation today. And one of the things that might push the modern era ahead of the 1980s in terms of a risk of nuclear war is that, unlike the 1980s, where we trained for nuclear war and we were prepared to fight a nuclear war, which is why there was a real risk of it, because it wasn't taboo. We were going to do it.
Mm.
Today, we operate under the notion that it's just not going to happen. No, people talk about it, but we're just not going to. It's not real. It's this fake thing that allows people like Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken to get up there and talk strong and big and thump their chest, because to them it's just a game. It's a rhetorical exercise. When in fact, if you listen to Russian President Vladimir Putin, nuclear weapons are real, and that Russia has red lines, and if those red lines are crossed, there's a real potential that Russia will use nuclear weapons. And if Russia uses nuclear weapons, it won't be a limited nuclear war; it'll be total nuclear war, and we're all going to die. The Russians have deployed nuclear weapons to Belarus because Belarus now has become an important Russian ally. They have sort of this economic political union. Their militaries are working almost seamlessly. And you have Poland and the Baltic states all implementing policies designed to overthrow Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, and replace him with a democratic leader. Indeed, one of these opposition figures, actually she was the wife of an opposition figure that she ran on the ballot in the contested election, I think in 2020. And she now resides in one of the Baltic countries where they have recognized her as the legitimate head of Belarus.
Oh, come on.
And so, from the Russian-Belarus perspective, you have Poland and the Baltic states actively conspiring to overthrow the Belarusian government. And so and with that, the potential of NATO attacking Belarus, because of course Poland and the Baltic states are NATO nations. And so Russia is basically replicating the nuclear umbrella that the United States already provides to NATO. People are sitting there condemning the Russian move. And believe me, I'm not happy about it. It's escalation. I understand why they're doing it, but I wish they did do it. But, Russia is basically giving Belarus access to air-delivered nuclear weapons and surface-to-surface missile-delivered nuclear weapons that will be retained under the control of Russia up until the point where they turn them over to the Belarusians. And then they would be launched based upon targets and joint procedures developed by Russia and Belarus. This is a replication, so to speak, of the capability that NATO enjoys with these B-61 bombs that have been they're stored, I believe, in 5 different locations throughout Europe. They support there's NATO nations like Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, and others have aircraft that are considered to be nuclear capable, and the pilots have been trained to deliver these B-61 bombs. And so, but NATO says, well, these weapons would have to be released by the United States before we could use it, all that stuff. It's not an independent nuclear thing. Well, the same thing holds true with the Belarusians. Mm-hmm. They don't have any nuclear weapons. They have access to nuclear weapons that can be loaded on Belarusian nuclear-capable assets, then be used in defense. But, in some ways, I consider this to be a good thing, not just, because someday this war in Ukraine is going to end. And if we live, there will have to be concerted negotiations about nuclear disarmament. And Russia has now just created chips. They have chips that can be traded, whereas before they didn't. And so there was never any dialogue about this. Russia has created chips that can be bargained away. And in many ways, it replicates something I write about in my book. That is the decision of the United States. They wanted the SS-20 missile to be removed, but the Soviets were like, why are we going to get rid of a missile that means everything to our national security? And what are you getting rid of? Nothing. And so the United States actually had to escalate the tension by deploying the Pershing II missile, the ground-launched cruise missile, putting chips on the table that now could be negotiated away, and we went to 0. So I think that's what's behind the Russian action. Because it doesn't change the nuclear equation one bit. In fact, it probably makes the any nuclear response that much more inefficient, because now you've put in extra procedures, moves, command and control, etc. It'd be much more efficient just to let Russia launch the nukes, because chain of command, control, is all seamless. But what Russia's done is put chips on the table, and I think that once this war ends, there hopefully will be a new arms control negotiation process. And one of the things that Russia will now be able to do is create the conditions for American withdrawal of the B-61 bombs from NATO by being willing to trade the Russian nukes that are in Belarus. This is something that's happened in the past. Everybody talks about the Cuban Missile Crisis,
Right?
And they operate under the assumption that America made the Soviets back down, and that's literally not what happened. The Soviets put chips on the table, creating a game where they were able to get
The Jupiter
the
missiles.
American Jupiter missiles that were in Turkey and in Italy withdrawn. The Jupiter missiles in Turkey were literally right on Russia's next door. I mean, we're all like, how dare the Russians put, missiles in Cuba? Well, how dare America put Jupiter missiles in Turkey aimed at the Russians? So they created the conditions for a horse trade, and then we did the same thing with the INF treaty, and I think that's what Russia's doing with this. So it's dangerous, but it's also, I think, forward thinking in terms of disarmament potential. My concern today, though, is that we are one mistake, one misunderstanding away from somebody using a nuclear weapon, and then we're all going to die, because there's no such thing as a limited nuclear war, not from the Russian perspective. And should the United States use nuclear weapons, should NATO use nuclear weapons against Russia, Vladimir Putin has already answered the question of what would he do. He said that, we'll launch and you'll all die and we'll all die, but we'll go to heaven as martyrs, meaning at least we have God on our side. The Russian academic Karaganov, who wrote this article that we alluded to about, a new preemptive arsenal, he's gambling on the fact that no American president will be willing to trade Boston for Poznan being a Polish city. So that gamble. If Russia, confronted by, a persistent NATO effort to destabilize it, opted not to wait for potential NATO success, but to preempt it by using a nuclear weapon against Poznan, that an American president would ultimately not retaliate because they're not willing to give up one or two or three or more American cities as a result. That's a gamble. I certainly hope that we never test that theory, but it's there, which makes the situation today very, very, very dangerous. This is why I do what I do. I mean, believe me, I don't like to hear myself talk, and every time I look in the camera on the screen, I realize that this is not a supermodel face, and people don't necessarily want to see this. But
no, people love hearing you talk.
The message is important, and it's a message not just about informing people about the situation in Ukraine, but to talk about what we're talking about right now, the threat that this current war in Ukraine creates that could lead to nuclear conflict. Every American, every European that says we need to continue supporting the Ukrainians has to ask themselves, to what end? Because if it's to the end of allowing Ukraine to reconquer the territories that Russia has annexed, that means that the Europeans want to die. Because if Ukraine were ever to succeed in this, the reconquering of Russian territory, that becomes the literal definition of an existential threat to the existence of Russia, which requires, under Russian doctrine, at least a consideration of the use of nuclear weapons. So you're asking Russia to nuke you.
Let me ask you this, Scott, because they hit the Kremlin with these drones, and I know it's not a nuclear missile and so on, but they were. It wasn't that a red line, obviously, because people were saying it was an attempt on Putin's life. So I mean that's one of the criteria, right?
Well, yes, they hit the Kremlin with a drone. And I don't mean to laugh because it's a serious thing, but it's like somebody putting a firecracker in my mailbox and me complaining to the FBI that somebody tried to blow up my house. They tried to kill me. They tried to assassinate me. No, they put a firecracker in your mailbox. They had a drone come in, and pop off on the dome did minimal damage.
Right. It's still
Putin
wild, though,
doesn't
to
live.
say it.
Putin doesn't live in the Kremlin. He resides elsewhere, and he was not under imminent threat. It was a provocation. I think one of the things that we're going to see from Ukraine is a series of provocations as they become more and more desperate. It's a provocation designed to provoke the Russians into creating the conditions that legitimize NATO intervention. So Ukraine is trying to get Russia to overreact and hopefully do something that gives NATO the green light to move into Ukraine. That's the purpose. Unfortunately, the Russians are smarter than this. Look what Shoigu said. He said that if Storm Shadows or HIMARS strike Crimea, then that Russia now recognizes that the United States and Great Britain are parties to this conflict, and they're at war with Russia. Now, one would think that if you're at war with Russia and you strike Russian territory, that the logic would dictate that Russia strikes back at you. But what did he say? He said that this will free us to launch attacks against Ukrainian decision-making centers, because Russia understands what's going on here. They're not going to do anything to create the potential of direct NATO military intervention. They're going to hold the perpetrators who are responsible for bringing American and British technology to Crimea accountable, and that means the Ukrainian leadership. And that's what I call escalation management. That's what other people call escalation management too. It's basically the Russians are going to manage this problem and so that it doesn't spin out of control. But if you listen to every Russian leader, they're all saying, this is a dangerous game.
Yeah.
Because at any moment, something could happen, get out of control. And next thing you know, we're going to be compelled to do something that will prompt your response. And we're ready for that. NATO's not. I still believe that NATO operates under the assumption that the Russians aren't serious, that ultimately Russia will back down. The good news is NATO is mortally weak right now. They have no offensive military capability whatsoever. So the risk of NATO intervening is minimal. But nonetheless, there's an absolute disrespect on the part of NATO about Russian military capabilities and the ability of Russia to deliver nation-killing strikes against NATO and the United States.
Isn't the one? I'm not going to say the number one rule, but one of the top rules in warfare: never underestimate your adversary. So I don't know what they're doing. I don't know what they're doing.
Well, I mean, you're instructed from day one: know your enemy as yourself. And it's clear that we do not know or understand the Russian enemy.
Yeah, Scott, you mentioned the Baltic states, and I was just thinking you have a lot of anti-Russian sentiment, especially in, shall we say, former Soviet satellite states or Warsaw Pact states. I saw the Czech president saying that Russians should be monitored in the West. They was basically spied on, and then put in camps, because he's mentioned the internment camps that the Japanese were in the U.S. And it's just, I don't know, I find this incredible, like how they just say these things and people don't care. It's like, whatever, fine. I
would direct him to the April 2005 speech that Vladimir Putin gave to the Russian Federal Assembly. That's the speech that has been widely misquoted in the West, the one where he said that one of the greatest tragedies of the last century was the collapse of the Soviet Union. That's somehow been turned into the greatest tragedy of the last century was the collapse of the Soviet Union, then full stop. And people are saying, see, Putin mourns the loss of the Soviet Union and wants to recreate the Soviet Union. That's what all the wonderful Putin scholars say. But they miss the next part of the sentence, which is because overnight tens of millions of Russians became homeless, without a home. And that's the important part, because from that came what I call the Putin doctrine, which is that his mission as a Russian leader is to protect the Russian nation, and that the Russian nation isn't defined by the geographical boundaries of the Russian Federation, but rather by the existence of the Russian people, people who have a common history, a common religion, a common culture. And his job is to come to their defense. Then one can say that the war in Ukraine is part of this policy. It's real. You know, the Russians get rightfully angry every time the Poles or the Balts or others tear down a statue commemorating the sacrifice of Red Army soldiers for the liberation of Europe against the Nazi threat. But Russia's also made it clear. I mean, they're not going to go to war over a statue.
I saw them. Sorry to cut you off, Scott, but I saw them graffiti. There's a big monument in Vienna, right? Because the Soviets lost tens of thousands of men liberating Vienna from the Nazis. They graffitied a Ukrainian flag around it, which I don't even know how that makes sense. Were there Ukrainians fighting with them? There Soviet forces. But anyway, sorry, please continue.
No, I'm just saying that, you know, if the Czech president builds a concentration camp and starts putting ethnic Russians in the concentration camp, Vladimir Putin and Russia will respond, and it will be a military response. I hope that the Czech president understands that.
Yeah.
That, you know, Vladimir Putin has made it clear that his job is to protect the Russian nation. And, you know, there's a difference between arresting one or two Russian businessmen on trumped up charges or, you know, things of that nature. And, you know, again, listening to this idiot, because there's no other way to describe this Czech president. He said, well, of course, the United States did it in the Second World War, rounding up 100,000+ Japanese and putting them in concentration camps. And I'm like, yeah, but that was proven to be A, unconstitutional, and B, counterproductive. And they were innocent people. And it was just, I mean, why would you pick that as your, that's like saying, I want to, you know, the police officer leaning, you know, kneeling on the neck of a man on the ground is a good technique because it was used against you know, George Floyd in Minneapolis. And it's like, no, that was proven to be murder,
right?
And you don't want to use that technique. This is the stupidity of the Czechoslovakian president. Truly, and I know my wife is going to listen to this. She's going to get mad at me because I'm not supposed to insult people. But how else would you describe it? This is literally the words of an ignorant, stupid man with no conception of history, of geopolitics, and of his pathetic little country's place in the world.
It's really shameful, and you know, I couldn't have said it better myself. It was so angering to hear this. It's just devoid of any morality or intelligence. It's just shocking, Scott. You know, Scott.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to go in about 5 minutes because
exactly. I was about to say
my
last. I don't want to keep you too long. My last question is about Blinken and China and the U.S. Position towards Taiwan and China. You know, he said that the U.S. is not interested in supporting independence for Taiwan, and then of course they issued a subsequent statement saying, "Well, if China attacks Taiwan, then we will defend them." Can you help me make sense of this?
Well, it's an effort to de-escalate. I think there's a recognition in the Biden administration that they've bit off more than they can chew in seeking to confront Russia and Ukraine and China and Taiwan. The United States has bankrupted itself from a military capacity. We either have very limited capacity to respond to a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, or no capacity because we've given it all away. There's a recognition of that too. There's a recognition that we can't beat the Chinese, not in a conflict in Taiwan, and that we could end up losing our preeminence in the Pacific through a conflict with China. The economic consequences of that conflict would be devastating to the United States. And so I think Blinken's trip was an effort to get America on a different track. It's difficult, though, because we have pushed ourselves into a rhetorical corner.
Do you think he means it?
Pardon?
You think he means it? It's a genuine effort.
Well, I mean, he doesn't want to mean it, but he has no choice. No choice whatsoever. Plus, he has to deal with the reality that America's policies are actually empowering the Taiwanese political opposition, the Kuomintang.
Yeah.
They're leading in every poll right now, and in November 2024, there's going to be an election in Taiwan, and it's very likely that the current pro-independence party and government that's in place will be replaced by the Kuomintang, who, while the government in power courts the United States and is actively working with the United States on these aggressive policies, the Kuomintang are actually traveling through China, meeting with Chinese Communist Party officials and talking about how better to integrate Taiwan with China, if not total capitulation, definitely tacking in a different direction. And if they win this election, then the United States will be caught out. We will have supported one side, and we will be isolated, and we'll have no leverage to stop China from then exploiting that and absorbing. So I think what we're trying to do is get ourselves back to a position of policy neutral, so to speak, so that whoever wins in November 2024 in Taiwan, we will be able to still say America's the best thing that ever happened to Taiwan, and you still need to work with us, going forward, because we need Taiwan to keep China preoccupied, to keep China weak. I mean, again, this is the reality of it. We don't care about Taiwan. We're not there to defend them. We're using Taiwan for our own geopolitical purposes to weaken and distract China from doing what it does best, which is global economic domination, Belts and Roads Initiative, things of this nature. That's what China specializes in. And so if we can get China confused on Taiwan, looking that way, they're not doing the other stuff, that's the purpose of it. I think we do know that there will never be an independent Taiwan. Just like we knew that Ukraine was never going to join NATO, but that didn't stop us from aggressively pursuing policies. But the war in Ukraine has sent a shot across the American bow, so to speak, meaning that we got involved in something. We're going to lose this conflict. Russia is going to win. There's no longer a doubt about this. So the question now is, what do we do in a post-Ukraine conflict world? And what we don't want to do is have part of the answer being we're in a very compromised, weak position with Taiwan and China. So I think Blinken's trip was the first step in bringing the United States into what I would call a policy neutral stance, so that we maintain leverage over Taiwan regardless of who wins the 2024 election.
You mentioned a shot across the bow, and I mean, that's literally what the Chinese ship did, I think, 2 weeks ago with the
yeah. Well, that's what and Blinken understands. China said that's going to happen every time you do this again.
Yeah, right, because it won't open the military lines.
Yeah,
either.
So I think again, Blinken wants to get into a policy neutral so that these situations, if they do occur, don't automatically get blown out of proportion. We need to back up a little bit to give ourselves maneuver room. But because if we keep going forward too aggressively, then something like that. What if the Chinese ship hits the American destroyer? What if 6 American sailors are thrown overseas? They drowned. What if a hole is broken in? The American ship is floundering, sinking. We now have a crisis.
Yeah.
And because we've escalated it so much, a crisis can go automatically into war mode. Whereas if we back off and create a buffer, if there is a crisis like that, we have room to maneuver diplomatically to prevent the outbreak of war. And I think that's what Blinken's trying to accomplish, is to get us to policy neutral.
Well, I wish him the best of luck if he's sincere and genuine about it, because as you mentioned, we are in a dire need of de-escalation with Russia and with China. So it can be a nice world without all these wars. Scott, thank you so much for everything you've said, all your time. I'm very grateful. And people, if you want to follow Scott, this is his Telegram. It's the link is t.me/Scott Ritter, and I'll copy and paste the link right now in the chat, so you guys can just click on it, and please buy and read Scott's magnificent book, Disarmament in the Time of Perestroika, Arms Control and the End of the Soviet Union. You can find it on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, pretty much every bookstore anywhere in the world. Scott Ritter, thank you so much. I'm so grateful to have you back on and to have spoken with you. It's always refreshing and a good time, even though perhaps these are not the most joyful subjects, but you know.
Well, thanks for having me. It's an honor and privilege to be here and to have an opportunity to interact with your audience. So thanks again, Richard, and I hope we can talk again soon.
Yes, likewise. Thank you very much, Scott. Take care. Bye-bye.
Record.
There you go, guys. That's Scott Ritter. He's a former United Nations weapons inspector and a intelligence officer in the United States Marine Corps. So here's his book. I'm putting it up on the screen, and that is his Telegram. So I see we've got about 2,500 people watching, so please make sure you've hit the like button, the thumbs up. I'm going to talk about one more topic right now, so don't go anywhere because this is really important. This is breaking news that from just a few hours ago. So just give me a second to set that up. And thank you to the kind person who sent a donation on YouTube. I haven't looked at it yet. Give me a second. I have to go into settings to read this out. But again, I'm grateful to everyone who's supporting the show. And if you want to, if you like my work, you found it informative, you learned something, please consider donating, whether it's on PayPal or Patreon. We got a new member who joined earlier, so two new members actually on YouTube. Let me read their names out and play them a crab dance, and then we can get back to business. So this is Sophia and also Rima. Thank you very, very much. I appreciate you guys supporting my work and joining on YouTube. Congratulations, because you've unlocked very funny emojis. Okay, so let me play the crab dance, and then we're going to continue. Don't go anywhere. Thank you, guys.
Clap for that, you stupid bastard.
And Corn Pop was a bad dude. And he ran a bunch of bad boys.
Listen, fuckhead, you have fucking crossed the line. Claiming I'm the enemy. You got that, you goddamn son of a bitch?
I don't give a fuck what you think, bitch.
Good morning. Sunday morning.
Cut that bitch off.
Thank you for Iron Dome, which is a technical marvel.
والله انت كلاب بصراحة يعني. ماشي نشتغل عادي.
We lied, we cheated, we stole.
China.
And you ain't black.
There's always the macro and then there's the micro.
Do not come. Do not come.
I'm gonna come.
You talking to me?
Ladies and gentlemen,
I'll have 2 number 9s for number 9 large.
we got him.
I told myself, I know it's not.
I've fallen and I can't get up.
Disgusting!
Why you texting? Why? You're getting nervous, man. Calm down. It's okay. Okay.
Suck my dick and choke on it. I yield my time. Fuck you.
All right. Thank you guys very much. We got a donation here from Angry Warhawk. Nice name. Says, if the Russians were to decapitate the Ukrainian leadership, would that end the conflict? I don't know if the question was for me or for Scott, but I will answer it. Here's the thing. The Russians don't want to do that because they're not trying to escalate. And that's why Shoigu is going on TV and saying, look, if you do this, we're going to have to respond by taking out the decision-making centers. Or, basically he means the government in Ukraine and Kiev. And he was referring to the idea that, or to the threat that they've said that there are HIMARS, which is an American system, and the Storm Shadow, which is a British system. These are missile systems that they will be fired on Crimea, and that they would respond by doing this. And I don't think it would end the war. I think, doing that is not in the interests of the Russians or anybody. There are other ways to end the wars, and that's why the Russians are pursuing diplomacy. But the fact that they withdrew from Kiev, remember, the Russians had Kiev encircled. If they wanted to take out the Ukrainian leadership, they would have done it a long time ago. That's not the objective. In any case, let me I appreciate the donation and thank you guys very much. Let me continue and give you this news that here. Okay, so I think you can see this on your screen in a second. How did you guys get a notification? I was wondering how you got it, because sometimes YouTube is not handing them out. But you know, when I just started, when I started before the interview, I told you guys to please tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from. There were only a couple hundred of you now. There are thousands of you. So please let me know in the chat what city you're tuning in from, what country, what state, what galaxy, what town, what village, and I will happily shout you guys out. In any case, let me please begin with the segment here. So here we go. So yesterday, Israel, you know, were completely decimated and defeated after raiding Jenin, and I did a whole video on that. But this is breaking news. This happened just a few hours ago, and I want to go through this with you. The Israelis not only occupy Palestine, they also occupy Syria. They have been occupying Syria illegally since 1967, right? So we are talking about the Golan Heights. The Golan Heights are, I mean, the Golan Heights are a jewel. They're a true gem, and I'll get into why in just a second. But basically what the Israelis are doing is they are trying to build wind turbines, right? So, you know, because it's clean energy, they think that they can get away with apartheid and they can get away with occupation. Well, the people who actually live there, the Syrians who live under this Israeli occupation, are having none of it. They're having absolutely none of it. So they've come out and started protesting, you know, and just so you know, this area in Syria is mostly, not only, but mostly or commonly inhabited by Druze, right? D-R-U-Z-E, and Christians, okay? So here you can see them coming out and protesting. I mean, hundreds of Syrians. And what are the Israelis doing? Of course, they bring out the tear gas, they bring out the water cannons, they bring out the batons, they bring out the rubber-coated metal bullets, and so here they are firing water at people protesting. You know, the thing is that the Israelis want to build, with a company called Energix, they want to build 23 wind turbines. These wind turbines will generate electricity, and who do you think will get that electricity, receive that electricity? You think Syrians are going to get it? No. The Golan Heights are such a rich, important place, full of resources, and they steal everything. And I find it so disgusting that they're wasting this water, firing it at the residents, at the farmers, at the people of this community, because they don't want to have their land stolen, right? The Israelis think that by doing this, they can just take their lands. You know, it's a way to kind of it's a way to execute ethnic cleansing, right? Oh, we're going to build a wind turbine. There's another case in Palestine I reported on, which was Masafar Yatta. Masafar Yatta is a Palestinian village, and the Israelis built a shooting range, a live training exercise area for their troops on a Palestinian village. So, you know, whether you like it or not, they just basically drive you crazy and out of your homes, and they drive you out of your, you know, your hometown. It's disgusting. It's absolutely disgusting. There's one journalist from El Mayadeen who was injured, right? I think from tear gas. There's another guy, I don't know if I don't think he was a journalist, but in any case, a civilian. I'm not going to show you the video because I can't, but his whole eye, his right eye, gone. You know, just swollen. I think I really hope I'm wrong, but I think this guy's going to be blinded for life. Why? Because the Israelis shot a metal bullet that is rubber coated, right? So they think by coating it with rubber, like that somehow makes it more humane. They always blind people like this. And this is not something actually just in Israel. You've seen this in France. You see this wherever these bullets are used. People have bruises that you would not believe, and they get blinded. So here is something else I wanted to show you. I wanted to go into, you know, what the hell is Israel doing there? Why are Israel here? Because the Golan Heights are green. They've got snow, right? There's a mountain. It's called Jabal al-Sheikh. It's got snow. There's water. There's gas. There's oil. Flowers. They got honey production. You name it. That's why and of course, the vantage point. You're in the Golan Heights. You can see the Sea of Galilee. You have this vantage point that is not only stunning because of its landscape, but from a military point of view, this is so strategic. And so 1/3, I want you, if you take away one thing from this video, is this. Please remember this. 1/3 of Israeli drinking water comes from the Syrian Golan Heights. They steal it from Syria. And in Syria, you open a tap, you can't drink that water. Actually, that's true in many European countries too, because Europe is supposed to be so developed and so on. But listen to what I'm telling you. This is a mountain that has water, that is full of resources, that could benefit Syrians. And no, the Israelis steal it and they take it for themselves. The United Nations has so many resolutions from the UN Security Council that I've lost count. I've lost count. The UN Security Council resolution number 242. This was passed a long time ago. We're talking decades before I was even born, telling the Israelis, get out of the places that you have invaded, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Syrian Golan Heights. Do you think the Israelis have ever applied this? No, of course not, right? Here's another UN Security Council resolution. This one is from 1981. Because why in 1981? Because the Israelis passed something called the Jerusalem Law. What does it mean? What does it entail? They basically annexed Jerusalem, all of it, right? And also annexed the Syrian Golan Heights. And just to give you an idea, you know how the United Kingdom, helped create Israel, basically handed it over, the Balfour Declaration, all these things, and how the United States bankrolls Israel. Even they could not support what Israel was doing. Can you imagine that? Even the United States and the UK were like, no, sorry, you can't do this. So they either, when I'm talking about these resolutions, the whole UN Security Council, so the 15 members, either all voted in favor of these resolutions, United States abstaining, which is basically a way of saying, look, we're not going to vote for it or against it, but we're going to stand aside and let this thing through. So you can't really blame us, right? So this is number 497, passed in 1981. And they say that the Security Council says that the Israeli decision to impose its laws, jurisdiction, and administration in the occupied Syrian Golan Heights is null and void and without international legal effect. And it demands that Israel, the occupying power, should rescind forthwith its decision. And it determines that all the provisions of the Geneva Convention relative to the protection of civilian persons in time of war continue to apply to Syrian territory occupied by Israel since June 1967. So, because Israel is the occupying power, they have a duty under international law to not abuse the people under their occupation, meaning the Syrians. What do? Tear gas, water cannons, Wow, Israel really cares about the UN. And why, this is important because right now, the Israelis, they say that, we are a country because, they draw their legitimacy from the fact that they're a UN member. So they say, we are a UN member state. We are the state of Israel, right? But then when the UN tells them get the hell out of Syria and Palestine, suddenly they don't care about the UN. The UN doesn't matter. So, they cherry pick. They pick and choose what parts of the UN charter they like, and so on, right? I was saying here, why the Golan Heights are so important. The Israelis have also built skiing resorts, right? So the Israelis on this stolen land, they have skiing resorts. Meanwhile, people in Syria are suffering from not just the lack of water, but you've got the Israelis bombing Syria every week, destroying the infrastructure. Syria and Israel have been at war since Israel appeared in the first place, because the whole idea is to take Palestine, to take Syria, etc. Right? So the Israelis can go and relax in Jabal al-Sheikh in their nice ski resorts, of course, at the expense of Syria. And they've also undertaken gas and oil exploration, right? So you remember I was reporting, I covered the fact that the Israelis were trying to take gas that belongs to Lebanon in the Mediterranean Sea, okay? Here, There's no dispute. It's like, screw you. We are taking the gas. We're going to look for it and find it and take it. Screw you. All right. And on top of that, they used the Golan Heights as a staging ground to launch their attacks against Syria. So the people who are from this area, the Druze, the Christians, they reject Israel entirely. They want nothing to do with Israel. Israel tries to legitimize itself by increasing its population. So they try to include these Syrians as supposed Israelis, and they're having none of it. They don't want Israeli citizenship. They don't want to be naturalized as Israelis. They're not going to take part in these sham elections. This is not Israel, Syria. Let me play this video. This is from today.
عملوا فلوا وعم لي قال هي الارض مش الك، كيف اثبت انه الك؟ مش حاطط لك جذور، مش عامل مش مسيجه. قلت لهم هي اللوزه بتشهد علي انه اللوزه بتكفي، مش هيجي عمل جذور لقال لك هي ارض الك. ما حدا بيسترجي يفوت على ارضك بدون علمك.
Man, they got no shame, really. You got people from Eastern Europe or wherever the hell they come from, coming in and pretending like they have jurisdiction. I'm sorry, man. People now all of a sudden you got people saying, oh, well, what Russia's doing is against international law, all this and that. Where is your concern for international law right now, today, with what Israel's doing, building turbines? I don't care if they're building, a St. Teresa's hospital or whatever the hell. I don't care if they're building 50 hospitals. First of all, they would never do that. No, but more importantly, they have no right to do that. No right to do anything to even be there. Zero. Right? Both of my parents, they worked in UN missions and peacekeeping missions. UNIFIL, which is Lebanon, Israel on the border, and also UNDOF, which is the one in Syria. Right? The Israelis don't care. They will bully the residents who live in these places in South Lebanon, in the Golan Heights. They will bully the UN themselves. If you literally go on YouTube right now after this video and look up Finnish UN troops and Israel, and you'll see Israeli tanks bullying them and so on. My mother was telling me just the other day how the Israelis were swerving, almost running them over, popping smoke. The tanks, they have smoke as countermeasures, like camouflage, temporary camouflage, popping smoke, just like harassing the United Nations. So they have no respect whatsoever for international law. And then they want to pretend, oh, we are a democracy. Oh, we care about minorities. Everybody is accepted here. We are civilized, not like those Arabs around us, right? We are the only democracy in the Middle East. Israel is not even a country, never mind a democracy. Israel is the opposite of everything that they claim to be. There is no justice there. There are no human rights there. It's a colonial project that started in Europe, that was launched by Europe, and that's what it will always be. Nothing but that. Okay, that's all it'll ever be. They're still occupying the Golan Heights. They refuse to leave, and they're making these people's lives hell. You need to understand that these farmers, this is their livelihood. Okay, they need these lands. The fact that Israel want wind turbines is irrelevant. They can go and stick their wind turbines where the sun don't shine. Go away. You can't just go and build something on somebody else's land. I don't care how good it is or how clean it is or what kind of energy it is. It's not your land. And keep in mind, this is another example of how the Israelis, they send in their so-called army and police to protect the illegal behavior of, in this case, Energix, this energy company, or Israeli settlers. So Israeli settlers can walk around, they can throw stones, they can fire their guns at Palestinians, they can do whatever the hell they want. And the Israeli army will follow them like bodyguards, right? To protect them because they're the chosen ones, right? They're more worthy than the rest of us peasants, right? The special Israelis, the chosen people. Man, it's really funny. But you're not going to see any of this on the mainstream media. You're not going to see any of this on the mainstream media because this runs counter to their narrative. That you're not allowed to say anything negative about Israel. No one's even trying to say anything negative about Israel. Israel shames itself with its own behavior. I'm only reporting the truth. This is just the truth. Israel shames itself with its own behavior. Period. That's it. There's nothing to it. people often forget that you know, of course, let me be very clear. The Israeli occupation in Palestine is way worse. That doesn't mean, though, that you should forget about the one in Syria. That doesn't mean you should forget that. Remember, South Lebanon, the Israelis invaded it multiple times, occupied it for decades, you know. They have no respect for anyone, and then they pretend that they're victims. Yeah. You guys are funny. This is all about taking a very important strategic area in Syria, about taking Syria's resources, and you know, basically making sure that Syria can never get back on its feet, and about bullying Syria. That's what it is. And always remember this. I want you to remember this when they tell you, oh, Russia is doing this in Ukraine. How about we deal with the original affronts and original offenses, right? How about we deal with these transgressions and illegal annexations? Why aren't we talking about this? This has been going on for decades. This goes back way further. Where was your concern for this? Zero. Again, I see we've got 2,000 people watching. Thank you guys very much for the support. And you know, people say Israel's an apartheid state. Israel is not even a state, but it's definitely apartheid and crooked. And I'm you know, I don't take these people seriously who pretend they care about international law and this and that. No. They don't even say this. You notice when they do these speeches, they say that international norms. What the hell is an international norm? You mean your way of doing things? What does that even mean? Anyway, you guys know the rest. I'm really glad you saw that video yesterday, the one with Jenin. Israel got humiliated in Jenin. Game over. You know, they got a good slap in the face, one that's been long overdue. In any case, thank you guys very much. Again, please let me know where you're tuning in from. I forgot to read your countries here. Come on, let's go. Thank you, Catherine. You're very kind. Thank you, Duan, for joining as a member on YouTube. I'm going to play you a crab dance in a second. And Holly says it was deserved. Yeah. Kiara says, did Israelis die in Jenin? The Israelis say no, but I think that's a lie, because if you look at the videos, I mean, anyway, here we go. Greece. We got people watching in Greece, Texas, Switzerland, New York City, South Africa, Ecuador, Philippines, Denmark, Moldova, Russia, Finland, the US Midwest, Algeria, Australia, Argentina, Monterey, California, New York City, Finland. Oh my God. I love you guys. Colombia, Texas, Iran, Belgrade, Chicago, India, Florida, Sweden, Baltimore, Munich, Portugal, New York City. Jesus, I'm so proud of you guys. Really, this is heartwarming. I mean, how can I not be happy with such a diverse community? I love you guys. Look, Pakistan, Somalia, it keeps going. Claudia, I know Claudia is watching. Claudia, she said Los Santos. We got to get the map going. Every time I save somebody's state or country or whatever, I want it to ding and light up. Somebody help me to get this going, all right? DVI says, as I Russian soldier, I thank for the truth, Richard. You're a Russian soldier? Well, in any case, I it's like I said before, I'm not here to, like, you know, the truth speaks for itself. And if we report the truth, people can make up their minds, right? And draw their own conclusions. But, and thank you for the kind comment. I appreciate that. But, you know, like I said, the truth speaks for itself. If we are talking about Israel's behavior, Israel shames itself. If we talk about NATO, NATO shames itself. I don't need to criticize NATO or say anything bad. I just tell you the truth and you will know. That's it. So thank you guys very much. Thank you, Duan. Thank you for joining as members. And I will play you a crab dance in a moment. And I also wanted to say thank you to John. John also joined on Patreon just now. We also have Mano, and we also have Zach. You guys rock. Thank you so much. If you guys like my work, you can donate $1 a month or 1 ruble a month. You guys were saying I should do the Trump voice yesterday. You guys, you should support my channel at all costs. This is the best channel of them all. Nowhere else will you get this type of analysis. They know, the crooked media. Now, thank you guys very much. All right, I'll leave the link below. It's patreon.com/RichardMedhurst, and I have an amazing t-shirt coming out soon, which you guys are going to love. Thank you very much. Take care. Ma salame and bye-bye, guys. Take care.
The war didn't start in February last year.
Yeah.
The war started in 2014. And since 2014, NATO allies have provided support to Ukraine.
NATO was going to shoot Putin in the foot either fucking way. So, you know, he had no choice but to do XYZ, right? Going to Ukraine. Now, I don't know about the annexation, but you understand? Because the other side of the argument is that, you know, if you don't stand up to a bully, and NATO is a bully, they're going to keep pushing you around and taking more and more and more. And this is going to, you have to understand, this history begins in 2014, right? Putin did not wake up on February 24th, you know, last year and just fucking randomly decide to invade a country. I mean, I'm not saying that was the best decision, but there is history here. And a very, very big geopolitical battle right in Ukraine, and the Ukrainians are, of course, the ones that suffer the most. You see this often, that you have these like Europeans lecturing Africans. You see the French doing it in Mali, in Chad, in Algeria. You know, even today, I'm not talking about like back 100 years ago only. Even today, the West is so envious, and they're dying inside at the idea and at the prospect of China coming in and forging nice relations with Africa. Because the European mentality is, we're gonna fuck Africa, we're gonna plunder Africa, we're gonna rape Africa, enslave Africa. The Chinese don't have this sick, disgusting mentality when they deal with other people, and certainly not in Africa. You see? Try going to the UK as an Iraqi or a Syrian. Look how they will play games with you, with the pretending it's the bureaucracy. It's disgusting, the imbalance, you know? It's the Europeans who should be rolling out a red carpet for the people that they colonized and oppressed, not the other way around. Please ask yourself this question. Be honest with yourself.
Clap for that, you stupid bastard.
And Corn Pop was a bad dude. And he ran a bunch of bad boys.
Listen, fuckhead, you have fucking crossed the line, claiming I'm the enemy. You got that, you goddamn son of a bitch?
I don't give a fuck what you think, bitch.
Good morning. Sunday morning.
Cut that bitch off.
Thank you for Iron Dome, which is a technical marvel.
والله انتوا كلاب بصراحة يعني. ماشي نشتغل عادي.
We lied, we cheated, we stole.
China.
And you ain't black.
There's always the macro, and then there's the micro.
Do not come. Do not come.
I'm gonna come.
You talking to me?
Ladies and gentlemen,
I'll have 2 number 9s. Number 9 large.
we got him.
I told myself, I know it's not.
I've fallen and I can't get up.
Disgusting!
Why you texting? Why? You're getting nervous, man. Calm down. It's okay. Okay.
Suck my dick and choke on it. I yield my time. Fuck you.